But if things keep going the way it is, and the current government formation keeps relying on corporations, it can easily lead to a national bankruptcy. They're too reliant on corporation tax to remain financing the future. Finance Minister Simon Harris and Public Expenditure Minister Jack Chambers finally got around last Friday to unveiling the coalition's medium-term fiscal and structural plan, setting out the broad thrust of spending plans from 2025 to 2030. The next four budgets, in theory, will be bound by the spending ceiling set down in the plan, part of the wider EU move to shore up fiscal responsibility after the last crash. Ignore its reassuringly banal title and sensible origins. The document produced last Friday sets out a wild ride for the Irish public finances, even assuming ministers stick only to the level of spending splurges to which this current coalition has committed. The plan as outlined will dramatically hike the cost of running the country, based in large measure on a Hail Mary belief that the corporation tax magic money tree is going to keep growing. The coalition plans to hike public spending by more than €37 billion by 2030, which is just 4 budgets away. Ignore any spin that this is about infrastructure. You always hear them on about infrastructure. The increases set out in the plan are overwhelmingly 30 billion plus for day-to-day government spending. A relatively paltry 6.6 billion is earmarked for increased capital investment in the likes of housing, water, transport and digitalisation. Yes, guys, what I'm doing here is reading out this because Ireland could easily become bankrupt, which many people wouldn't realise. The increases set out in the current plan are overwhelmingly 30 billion plus euro for day-to-day government spending, which is a relatively paltry 6.6 billion is earmarked for increased capital investment in the likes of housing, water, transport and digitalisation. Voted current spending will rise from 93 billion euro in 2025 to 124 billion euro. Capital spending will rise from 16.6 billion euro to 20.7 billion in the same period. The reason for this, guys, is this current government formation is far too reliant on corporation taxes for its own good, which can easily lead to a national bankruptcy. Ministers will point out that it is relatively a bigger rise in percentage terms for the capital side. They'll say the spending increases out to 2030 actually represent a degree of moderation in percentage terms again, relative to the past 5 years. Reality struggles to tear its eyes off the 30 billion figure. True, it's a slowdown in percentage terms versus increases of 9.4% over the past 5 years, but from a new high base. Lads and lassies, I'm sure you wouldn't want to return to what we remembered not too many years ago, a national bankruptcy. But it's quite possible if this government remains reliant on corporation taxes that it can happen, guys. In 2019, total gross voted expenditure was just over 67 billion euro. It is currently 110 billion this year and set to increase to 147 billion by 2030. That doesn't include unknowns such as servicing the national debt. And yes, for those of you that don't realise it, Ireland is currently in debt to the tune of 158 billion euro. Capital spending on housing and big capital projects is an element of the growth, as is an ageing and growing population, though that's not really going to change much within the next 5 years. The bigger issue is simply the increase in size and activism of the state. The politics of tax and spend are now firmly entrenched under the supposedly centre-right Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. For example, there are now 66,500 more people on the public payroll than there was back in 2019. And no sign of that to slow down. More nurses in wards, more Gardaí on the streets, and teachers and teaching assistants in classrooms, things people love to see. But they have to be paid every year, regardless of what happens to the tax take. They'll all need pensions eventually. The government also increasingly sees a need to cover directly far more of the cost of public services such as health, education, childcare and public transport, and far more of the population. Essentially whether they need it or not. Cheaper buses and free school books are certainly nice to have, but added all together, it's a really big and expensive change in the way Ireland is run. And that's the rub. Those bills won't just be tough to meet if the corporation tax billions get redirected elsewhere, which, guys, can happen, and which, if happens, will return to national bankruptcy. And that's the rub. Those bills won't just be tough to meet if the corporation tax billions gets redirected elsewhere, or the private sector jobs market suffers a significant dent. They'll be impossible to pay. The budget plan itself, more or less, acknowledges as much. If the corporate tax take, which we know is driven by just a handful of multinationals, fails to grow after 2025, then Ireland is on a trajectory to run out of financial road just 2 budgets from now, in 2028, when we'll be plunged into a deficit, and by 2030 we'll be forced to borrow 7 billion to maintain spending. If the corporate tax windfall begins to shrinks back to 2020 levels, we'll be plunged into a public finances crisis, at least as bad as 2008 to 2011, with deficits bulging out to more than 15 billion euro by 2028 and worsening rapidly. The rainy days funds will be swiftly used up if that scenario happens, and our borrowing costs will balloon. Swinging austerity would become inevitable, and a second national bankruptcy in a generation would certainly be on the cards. That's because this coalition / government is far too reliant on corporate taxes. The rainy days funds will be swiftly used up in that scenario, and our borrowing costs will balloon. Swinging austerity would become inevitable, and a second national bankruptcy in a generation would certainly be on the cards. I don't think you guys would like to see country going back into national bankruptcy again, because who's going to have to bail it out? Us bollockses of taxpayers. That might not happen. The tax miracle may continue, although a move in the US in the last week by the IRS to get its hands, that's the Internal Revenue Service over there, guys, to get its hands of a bigger share of Meta's global tax bill looks ominous. And the jobs boom may go on for another half decade. But the coalition's spending plans depend on corporation tax growing to €42 billion in 2030, around 10 times what Ireland collected in 2014 and around double what was collected in 2023. It is very hard to see budgeting on the basis as anything but wildly irresponsible. So guys, the coalition has unveiled wild spending plans that threaten a return to national bankruptcy. The government is far too reliant on corporation tax to finance the future, but yet they are doing it. So guys, and I will have to be kept on the ball, because I'm sure us taxpayers, when it's not our fault, does not want to be paying for their mistakes again. I just don't think taxpayers are prepared to do it again, because they're suffering enough with the cost of living crisis at the moment. Okay guys, enjoy the rest of your evening, and if we don't talk to you again between this and Christmas, have a happy and healthy Christmas. Okay guys, talk to you. Bye bye.